I'm Paul Borowski, Chief Distribution Officer, Sealy Investment Securities, your host, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Clint Sorensen of Wealth Shield. Clint, glad to have you here this week for this ep of the Fat Pitch podcast, and I'm thrilled to welcome our guest, Jack Dreifuss. Clint, I only met Jack a little while ago, so why don't you fill our audience in on all things Jack before he tells us even more.
Yeah, so Jack is the founder of Impatient Ventures, and he focuses on really disruptive companies in the early stages of their growth cycle. Very excited to talk about venture capital and everything that's kind of going on in the marketplace. So super excited, Jack. Thanks for joining us. Why don't you give the audience a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Clint. So I guess I've been in the founder ecosystem for, it'll be actually officially a decade next month. I moved to San Francisco in 2013. I worked in a variety of startups, both as a founder and as an early stage employee. And kind of through that journey, I had kind of the full life cycle of, wins, losses, and everything in between, and just understanding kind of, what people mostly read about anything is usually 10% of what it actually is. And so having lived through kind of that sort of last, great sort of bull market that was primarily driven through a lot of what was coming out of, the Bay Area where I was fortunate to have kind of gotten my sort of Harvard network. My next door neighbor was a co-founder of Postmates, and a guy that I played golf with every week was a partner at Andreessen Horowitz. And so, I was fortunate to have lived through kind of enough of the kind of full gamut of Silicon Valley that now kind of in the last year, I've been building this new fund that, I've gotten to partner with folks like Clint on. So yeah, happy to tell you more about that.
Tell us, the name Impatient immediately piqued my curiosity. I think as investors, in some regard, we're all a little bit impatient. So where'd you come up with the name, and what's your philosophy?
Yeah, so, the original very first name when I was kind of investing more on the side while I was still operating was actually an homage to my love for fried chicken. So the initial name was actually Karage Capital, which is the Japanese fried chicken. And,
love that.
And then eventually I evolved it because of my Jewish roots to Schnitzel Capital. And so for actually this first couple of deals that I did, there's actually a press release of me leading a seed round in a company as the general partner of Schnitzel Capital. And I think when I kind of was now turning it into the main focus and what my day-to-day is, I needed to name it something that still had a little bit of tongue-in-cheek and humor, but wasn't quite as ridiculous as, fried chicken. So, yeah, it's meant to be kind of a play on the fact that, like, this game is a patient game, but we live in an incredibly impatient world. So, simple as that.
Well, if you ever make it to Dallas, where I hang my hat, good South African Jewish friend of mine makes some great karagi, oddly, and the best chicken schnitzel I've ever had.
I was in Dallas for the first time a few months ago and loved it. So that'll be a good motive for me to come.
Well, we'll go on a culinary adventure.
Perfect.
So, Clint, go ahead. What do you got for Jack?
Yeah, so Jack, one of the things that really intrigued me and kind of I feel like, bound us together was this kindred spirit on same philosophy as in regards to deglobalization. So we talked a lot about Peter Zehan's work, talked about, which obviously from a title of the book is The End of the World is Just Beginning, which is fascinating as a title. But we talked a lot about that work and what that meant for the U.S. And you had just such a great optimistic viewpoint on what that can mean. And so talk a little bit about your fund and your view and really your philosophy on deglobalization and how you plan to take advantage of that for investors.
Yeah, definitely. So, I think that if you think about kind of the sort of period where, maybe kind of heading out of that sort of that book is built around the end of the world is just the beginning, kind of post World War II, we had this kind of wild integration of all of the sort of countries that were once either at odds with each other or for whatever reason weren't, trade partners. Kind of the U.S. sort of winning World War II sort of created this really unique phenomena for the first time in the world where, outside of the U.S. and its, mighty military, most other countries no longer needed to focus on military power because the U.S. kind of policed everything. And so everybody could just focus on one thing, which is economic prosperity. And so that opened up the doors for, Japan and Germany, who lost World War II, to now become today two top five, GDP economies in the world. And that was primarily driven through nobody needed to worry about building a sort of military aspect to their country. They could just focus, like I said, on growing their economy. And so that sort of spurred so much growth in the world in terms of innovation and trade and collaboration. And, we now seem to be getting to a point where, the ongoing war in, sort of Ukraine and Russia, the growing tensions between the US and China. There's sort of this now large sort of redistribution of kind of trade partners and where things are made and who's trading with who. And so I think in the spirit of the US, we outsource the vast majority of our supply chain to low-cost labor markets, primarily in China. And, I think that because of that, we were able to obviously focus on, much more innovative, sort of knowledge economy based type of work. But now that sort of this tension point is sort of reaching ahead a bit, we seem to be in a position where a lot of the supply chain that we sent offshore, there's momentum to bring it back. And so that's going to require a hell of a lot of improvements and funding, and where we're spending a lot of time kind of paying attention to what are those technologies that will enable that to happen.
It's interesting. I hang my hat in the industrial warehouse distribution and fulfillment space. So we think constantly over the past couple of years about that sea change or regime change that you talked about, right? I mean, it's remarkable. You had a peace dividend, you had demographics in your favor and deglobalization, and now we've had this shift. So we talk a lot about friendshoring, onshoring, or nearshoring. So I presume a lot of that calculation and thought goes into where you're at.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's kind of interesting that I'm sure both of you guys and for any of the listeners are familiar with, Taiwan Semiconductor, who's the primary chip manufacturer in the world. They produce around 90% of the global semiconductor chip production. And as much as that seems like, well, they must just know how to do something no one else does. Well, it's kind of bizarre because, we invented the semiconductor chip, right? And so it was like, oops, we invented this tech and negated sort of this by letting Taiwan do it for 40 years. And now we don't have the trade knowledge anymore on how to make the very thing we invented. So, and kind of the same with every, manufacturing. And what it really comes down to is it's all driven through profits, and you want low cost labor for better profits when it comes to kind of making things inside of any type of facility, whether it's a semiconductor chip or, a steering wheel. And so for a while, it was driven through just wherever things could be made the cheapest. And now for a number of reasons, both, primarily national security, that's got to change, but that will require a huge step up in the trade knowledge that we've lost as a country.
Lost and given away.
Yeah, lost and given away. No question about it. So I think that there's going to be two things that are going to happen. Obviously, we have the advent of, machine learning that's, really taking its shape in every industry. But I think that is going to be a big boon for us to be able to bring back a lot of jobs inside of manufacturing by automating a lot of the lowest kind of totem pole labor work that really a robot or software could replace, and create an innovation on the factory floor that will still be from an American standard sort of thing, a compelling and rewarding job. But I think it'll also require a lot of U.S. government support. So I expect that, similar to the CHIPS Act and I always get the tongue twister, the Build Back Better.
Build Back Better.
I think there's going to be a litany of kind of bipartisan support in either administration. They'll spin it in a different way to be able to galvanize and regalvanize an industry that was once, 30 to 40% of our economy and is now down to sub, 10%, which is in the, everything sort of manufacturing and supply chain.
Yeah. And you're still creating jobs, and that's how they'll get by this pernicious political partisanship, as I like to say, because you will automate that the lowest rung of jobs to create, economic viability, but you're still creating jobs, and then you're creating support jobs around that production.
Yep.
Whether it's warehousing, shipping, restaurants, cafes, housing, what have you, around it. So we think that renaissance too. It's interesting. I didn't know when we got on today that we'd be aligned in that. Well done, Clint.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. And now, Jack, what are you seeing? What types of companies are you seeing out there that are kind of doing this, right? Taking advantage of these trends. I know of a few just in our conversations, but yeah, why don't you give the audience a little bit of color around, you don't have to give names or anything, that's up to you, but around what companies you're seeing doing some really cool stuff in the space and,
sure.
And really helping us lead that track.
Yeah. I mean, so, I had more of a traditional sort of software career and sort of the companies I operated in, and it was kind of actually two investments that led me down the rabbit hole of getting pretty interested in kind of the manufacturing sort of physical space of innovation, and it was companies that obviously Clint we've looked at together, and I don't know if I can speak, freely about, our co-investing in some of these deals, but, one of them was a vertically integrated consumer brand. I think it was sort of through realizing the edge that they had and sort of not only being the sort of front end brand that has a direct to consumer sort of Shopify based store for what they sell, but also the fact that they were, masters of their own destiny because they also made their own product. Did I realize kind of the edge you had and specifically the consumer brand space where you could, rapidly improve the product, innovate on the supply chain side of things to improve margins, by creating innovations of kind of how the bottles get filled across the fill line. And just realizing that by having that as a sort of skill and an edge inside of a, early stage consumer brand, they've now in a world where there's been kind of a contraction inside of consumer spending and just from a discretionary standpoint, I'll check my data with the macro economist folks on here. They're thriving, and I think they're thriving because of the fact that they own their own destiny by not only selling the product but also making it. So that was kind of investment number one that really led me down to realizing how much of an edge it was in the consumer space. And then kind of flip to the other side of it. We invested in a company several years ago. I personally invested, and then I invested on behalf of my LPs into a company called Nanotronics that, I think, you'll hear that name. And I think over the next 5+ years, it'll become one of the most important companies in the United States.
Wow.
Their initial business was quality control for production inspection. So you produce, small parts like a semiconductor chip. Obviously, you have no margin of error of that chip being produced correctly, both in its, if it's contaminated, if the parts are aligned the right way. And so these guys have basically built this product called NSpec that's been inspecting, production lines of the leading, most advanced, consumer electronics and chip manufacturers in the world. And they're kind of now hitting this sort of final frontier that I'll speak briefly about, but it's kind of waiting to sort of fully hit the markets, and there'll be news about it soon. But they're going to basically enable, I think, the U.S. to bring a lot of chip manufacturing back on shore. And it's because they've spent 15 years inspecting on producing chips across every type of company you could think of that produces a semiconductor chip and making sure they produce it accurately. They've now built up the sort of the machine learning knowledge to be able to now enable companies to be able to do chip manufacturing for themselves. And so I can't, speak enough about both the CEO, but just the level of impact that'll have on us reshoring a technology, like I said, that we invented, right? The advanced microchip. And yeah, those two companies, I have a vertically integrated oatmeal company, and mentioned that's what they sell, that business that, is on track to do 9 figures of revenue this year from, a tenth of that 2.5 years ago when we invested. And then, in a sort of smart factory that's going to allow us to reshore semiconductor chip production. And those two kind of just perfectly sit in symmetry with each other. That just made me kind of go down the rabbit hole and realize that this is going to be one of the most both lucrative efforts and, sort of American supporting efforts over the next couple decades.
That's fantastic. So are you primarily an early stage equity investor? Is that how you generally take a position in an idea or a company?
Yeah. So we like to kind of be, if we can be first money in, great, but near and around kind of pre-seed and seed, opportunistic Series A if it's really in the wheelhouse of where we're betting on, but we just found the company too late. So yeah, primarily early stage. We like to be a leader, not a follower. We will follow though if we have to. But I'm very sure in this sort of strategy and investing in reshoring U.S. manufacturing, and I do sincerely believe that it's going to be not only good for the country, but it's going to be a bipartisan effort to support that.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I personally love Nanotronics' story.
Yeah.
Thanks to Jack, got to visit the facility up there in Brooklyn Yards, and it was just fantastic. So
it's in Brooklyn Yards.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, they actually,
awesome.
Their headquarters are in the original U.S. submarine assembly facility. It was like during the Lincoln Wars, the place where the first submarines were getting assembled. And they basically took that over and built their kind of own machine shop where they build their hardware. It's, hardware and software. And pretty soon, based on this sort of new product that I can't speak too much about, but is, in and around the ability to kind of produce, semiconductor chips in-house, which is what their technology is going to enable, they might take over a former airstrip in Brooklyn as well to kind of put this chip fabricator.
Yeah, that's really neat. Say, along the lines of what we're talking about with moving manufacturing back, do you think at all about the trade issues with China? I mean, obviously at the beginning, of it, every company along the food chain had gone to a China plus one strategy. That's literally what it was called. So whether it was China plus Vietnam, China plus Mexico, China plus Uruguay, does that play into your thinking at all? Because at least from our vantage point, we don't see any abatement of that anytime soon. It's almost cute to think of pre-COVID in 19 when Trump and Xi both told everybody they had just solved the first stage of it. You remember that, guys?
Right. Yeah.
Trade wars.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that there is there's kind of a silent war slowly going on. And, I've just been hearing its rumblings. I mean, on the one hand, you have, the banner headlines of, Montana bans TikTok. I don't know if Florida has done this yet, but was planning to ban DJI drones, which is the Chinese, autonomous drone company. And I think I had heard recently, although I need to get my facts checked here, so that, China imports a lot of food from the US. We obviously produce all of our consumer electronics there. I mean, I think last year we produced the most ever. It was like $500 billion worth of consumer electronics.
Yep.
So it's like we're still producing now more than ever inside of China. But there's this kind of like slow war of attrition of like us stopping doing something, banning something, and they're now doing the same thing. So I think I had heard that they stopped buying certain crops from Texas and another state.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah.
That they cut back on some of it living here in Texas. As far as Florida, Jack, DeSantis is too busy fighting with a mouse and Bob Iger. So I don't know that he got around to fighting with anyone else.
Yeah. So I think that there's going to be just kind of this like who blinks first kind of Mexican standoff of sorts until something major happens. But I think it's going to be kind of this like, Virginia and Glenn Youngkin, I think, had the Taiwan prime minister recently have this major visit. And I think Youngkin's in Virginia, right? I think so.
Yep.
Yep. And, he had the prime minister come and they announced that they're setting up a trade office inside of Taiwan, Virginia. But, China's a $10 billion trade partner. Taiwan's a $1 billion trade partner. For him to come out and sort of say, hey, we're welcoming the prime minister. We're going to set up an office there and, we're going to protect our relationship with Taiwan. I mean, that's a big statement to make with, where your largest trade partner is looking at that as kind of a bit of a raised chin.
Slap in the face.
Yeah, slap in the face, the middle finger. Yeah. So, I again, Biden's going down the same, play here. I think this is ultimately a bipartisan effort. And, I think it ends up in a world where we're all scared of AI taking away a lot of jobs. I think that AI is actually going to be the very thing that allows us to reshore manufacturing and create
no question
more jobs.
Yeah, it's going to literally take out that L side of the P&L for a lot of those jobs, and AI will enhance it. I think a lot about 3D printing too, just because of light industrial and what you can do. I think that lends further credence to what you're talking about alongside the chip stuff. And it allows Clint, we talk about deglobalization. You always talk about decentralization. So it allows, multiple inventory and production sites at a low cost.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, 3D printing is not something that I am as competent in, but it does seem like, the Star Trek sort of future state is that you'll be able to kind of like, point and shoot and build a car. And, but the question is just what's the sustainability of kind of the materials?
Well, I'll give you a different one. I was down speaking to a group of folks in Houston in the oil and gas patch, and they talked about they're in the midstream business, in the pipeline type of business, and they talked about very much working actively on 3D printing for parts, ongoing for stuff. Now, that inherently made sense to me. I think I see you both nodding. Like, that just makes sense to me for a company that's in the parts business.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that the interesting thing is on the one hand, we obviously have things as advanced as kind of, artificial intelligent tool design. That's an area that we recently invested in. How do you kind of create the very sort of tools that allow us to create parts? So, we invested in a company called Atomic Industries that is using computation to design plastic injection molds. And so to the extent you're familiar with, plastic injection molds, that's a $60 billion industry that, accounts for the vast majority of products that we use on a daily basis. But making those steel molds that create our iPhone cases and our shampoo bottles and our car doors is an extremely expensive, laborious, non-standardized process. And so there's so much baseline sort of catch up that is low-hanging fruit right at our feet. And actually, interestingly enough, it was kind of this perfect storm. The same day I met the CEO of this company, I had actually gone to a site visit at Nanotronics, Brooklyn Navy Yard's facility. And it just so turned out that another fund that I co-invested with in this deal was having the CEO of Nanotronics do a diligence call with this CEO of this AI industrial tool design company and said to me, this was so obvious. I don't know why we didn't think to do something like this.
That's always a great.
It's always a great sign. And I think that there's just so much low hanging fruit. We're evaluating a company right now that's building sort of a GitHub, if you're familiar with the kind of, popular code repository platform for machine automation code. So, the biggest innovation was kind of putting a computer on the factory floor to tell machines what to do programmatically, lift, spin, push, fill, et cetera. But, that happened 40 years ago, and that's been the crux of innovation inside the U.S. manufacturing industries, and there hasn't been really much improvement since. And so, the ability to manage the code that runs those machines in a cloud seems like something that you'd think would have been done at the advent of the cloud, 15 years ago, and yet it's still managed like an Internet One sort of, version control and management process. So there's so much low-hanging fruit that like the job creation and the opportunities are so massive, both from a return on investment, but just a job creation standpoint, that, I think you could see cities that once were the Silicon Valleys of this country, like Detroit, Michigan, and the likes, become those sort of magnets for innovation once again, if we can embrace the fact that this necessary innovation to reshore manufacturing will be a boon, across every city and state.
And it's really AI supported manufacturing, which I love so much, because there's this whole AI craze going on, right? About generative AI and natural language processing, and everybody's kind of wrapped up in that. But when you really start to think about the applicability and how it adds so much value long term to society, you're going to eventually, come down to, AI that supports manufacturing. It's almost like every company became a tech company.
Yeah.
Every company is going to eventually become an AI company.
Yep.
And I just think it's fascinating. Yeah, this is just such a fascinating space because it's going to just increase yield.
Yep.
Right. Ultimately, lower costs across the board.
Yep.
And then my favorite part, decentralize it. Right. So you're not going to have just centralized, huge conglomerates that dominate the space. You're going to have more of a decentralized approach. And that's what really got me on what's going on in Nanotronics. I just love that whole approach. Right. I just think that just supports and provides the necessary fodder for success and upward mobility for society. So really exciting stuff.
I got a question. So Jack, we started out, you kind of went down the line of the chip manufacturing. Now we just talked about the AI supported, the other stuff. What are some other verticals, industries? What else are you curious about right now?
Yeah. So wherever you stand on, ESG, sustainability, climate, or otherwise, there is just going to inevitably sort of be a necessary commensurate climate impact consideration for both the reshoring of U.S. manufacturing and just the standards of how things get made and move in this country. And so I think similar to a lot of these sort of alternative energy industries and whatnot, they've obviously been riddled with a lot of kind of growing pains, as any startup does, whether it's fraud or bad participation or the tech not getting to where it needs to be to really take off. And so we invested in a company that hasn't kind of come out of stealth yet, so I won't name it too heavily, but, it's in and around how do you kind of create better verification and checks and balances inside of the carbon credit space. There's obviously been a ton of money that's plowed into it. I think it was something like a quarter of all venture dollars in 2022 went into the climate technology space. And so everybody's kind of coming out and saying, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. We're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, electrification of car companies and whatnot. And so I think there's a bit of a pie in the sky and sort of, hope that that'll happen. It's going to take probably a lot longer than people are thinking. But I think there's going to be a government sort of standard around what is your climate impact. And so decarbonization alongside deglobalization, it's easy to kind of say because of the D's, decentralization are definitely in and around the kind of space that we're paying attention to. And, I think that the innovation on the climate sustainability, the decarbonization space is both a necessary piece of, I like to say at a simple level, you put a loaf of bread in the oven for too long, it's going to get burned. And, we've been spending kind of the last 100 years putting a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. And so, we've obviously had, global greenery, and we've had sort of record improvements in certain respects from carbon because it is the food of plants. But, you get to imbalance and that can create problems. So I think decarbonization, and I think the government's going to be getting pretty behind that. I think, the days of sort of banning plastic straws is sort of, we got to move beyond that into something that's more, impactful. And so I think that's going to be another area we're pretty heavily focused on. The last area I'll sort of say that, tends to be of interest here is, I think that in the world we live in now, where there's this debate of kind of, is it hybrid work? Is it remote work? Or is it in office? I heard an argument the other day that actually hybrid work is kind of a cop-out, because if you're only in the office a couple of days and not in the other days, then it's like, well, you're kind of forcing people to live in this way where it's like, is this really adding value? Why am I going to like, you're either in the office or you're out of the office. And it was a decent argument. I don't actually know. But what I will say is that, say what you will about what was right to have done during COVID, it did ultimately unlock a lot more cities and states inside the United States, and it unlocked a lot more countries to be able to have labor available. And so I think because we have decentralized the workforce of sorts, and we can access talent in states like, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Alabama, and otherwise that were not necessarily key players in the sort of tech and startup scene, all of a sudden you can have participation because we have decided that remote work is a feasible way to still run a company. We're still waiting for data here. We don't know what's right. We got a lot of advocates that are saying there's no way it works. You got other people that say you just don't know how to manage people. Well, that's your problem. So, but I think what it does spell is the opportunity for there to be a lot more habitation, specifically in the United States, where people can go and live in different sort of cities inside Ohio and be a high earning, member of the innovation sort of AI space, whatever it is. And so, I'm particularly curious and interested to kind of track along. We're actually incubating a business in and around sort of this arena of how do you kind of unlock commerce in more of the US that's not just kind of the 4 major states that we're used to it all existing in. So I think local commerce is pretty interesting, and I think local agriculture is pretty interesting. I haven't bitten off anything yet in that arena, but I think we're all waking up to high fructose corn syrup, forever chemicals, and all the crap that's in our food and our,
very much so.
I think seed oils.
Yeah, we're waking up.
Not to mention the palm oil that's destroying the other half of the world.
Not to mention the, galvanized lead pipes that are feeding municipal water into our homes and, poisoning us at many different angles. So I think we're waking up to the most understanding of how to lead and live healthy lives. And, we used to have, for some reason, dawned on me that the reason we call it unleaded gasoline is because there used to be lead in gasoline that we burned until 1975. I mean, my mind kind of spilled out of my ears when I heard that. I did not realize that was, you used to go to the doctor and he'd be smoking a Marlboro while he's giving you his prognosis on how to live a healthier life.
Yeah, now we think that's bananas. We're going to look at a lot of things like that. Coming from a guy who's talking to you from Texas, there will be a day when we think the idea of burning fossil fuels unrepentantly was absolutely insanity.
Oh, totally.
As well. I looked into vertical farming about 2 years ago and found that to be utterly fascinating. And it mixes in with a lot of new styles of, to your point, reimagining what the city center is. I'm right there with you. I look at cell phone pings in downtown areas. So you're in New York today, I think. I just saw, I think in the Times weekend, or as Trump would say, the failing New York Times. I looked at the fact that cell phone pings are at pre-COVID levels, not maybe in Midtown, but all over the Brooklyn neighborhoods, in downtown, and in parts of Queens and other things. So the city's being reimagined as a place where people gather to be with other people and to be productive with their work, but with their minds, with their sense of community, with greenways. So I think that all ties into a lot of the things you just talked about. And I think you'll start to see the advent of urban farm and some of the healthy themes you talked about, along with the attention to the climate.
Yeah. Well, don't get me started. I've got a couple of tinfoil hat sort of theories on a handful of this stuff. But, we started farming something like, 12,000 years ago. We domesticated the cow 10,000 years ago. We lived on farms. We produced our own food. It was all there. It was all available. And only in the last 100 years have we moved to this city life. And it's so foreign to people. Peter Zahan talks about this. It used to be that you'd have as many kids as possible because it was free labor for your farm. Yeah. And now you have kids and they're a dirty, line item that, costs you money as opposed to produce, your crops and milk the cows. And so I think we're so in our infancy of figuring out how to get accustomed to just being so plugged into, the global sort of information system that we're all a part of and trying to make sense of. And so I can tell you, I grew up in a suburb, but now over the last 10 years of being independent, I've been, every time I am at any farm, I just feel like my bones get softer and I'm more at ease. And I don't know, it's just bred into us. The modern human was bred and evolved through this sort of farm settlement thing we did for such a long time. And it's really only in this little fingernail in history of our species that we've now moved away from that. And so I've started drinking, and your people are going to say like, oh, did you hear that from this podcast or not? I honestly just started doing it on my own. I do listen to some of the podcasts that might purport to sort of recommend it, but I started drinking unpasteurized milk.
Raw milk, yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, I've been doing that for a year now, whole unpasteurized milk. I mean, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew that allegedly we're all sort of lactose intolerant according to the standard.
Yeah, you guys live in the Pepto aisle.
Right. Well, so I thought that was the case. I grew up eating, cereal with, 2% milk and whatever. And I would just, I'd be making fart jokes in class and in middle school. And I swore off milk and I went to the plant-based milks and I was, that was the thing I did. And I will tell you again, I was unaware too of what's often in these plant-based milks, which is some combination of seed oils and unbelievable amounts of sugar and preservatives. And we went from, the final moments of the Got Milk campaign where every star athlete was recommending dairy to down with dairy and down with, I've now been drinking whole unpasteurized milk for a year. And I tell you, it feels right and it tastes great. And I've had no issues. I drink raw kefir. My stomach's been amazing because of the probiotics from that. And I've proselytized and converted a lot of people to my milk religion. And I have convinced many people who swore off, dairy and milk, and now they're drinking it regularly. And so I think it's just, we're waking up as a society to a lot of information that I think was told to us and we never actually learned for ourselves. And it's invigorating. And so I hope to one day own a farm somewhere. I might go to Montana. I have no problem with TikTok being banned. So,
hey, that's my spot.
Yeah. All right. We can be neighbors.
You can go down to Austin and eat some raw, antelope with Rogan too.
Yeah.
Grass-fed antelope. Well, I don't want to overstay our welcome today. These are some fascinating themes. Clint, you're the investment expert. I'm just the dumb guy here. How you want to ask Jack a couple questions, more investment questions, and then we'll take us out for today?
Yeah, no, I think we covered everything. I think the only thing I have is a better question, which leads to investment success. But I want you to tell the audience a little unknown secret about you and your poker history, because I think this is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that we could have a whole other episode on this. I truly believe life is one giant poker game. It's a little bit of luck and a little bit of skill. And, most people say life is chess, not checkers, but that's actually an untrue thing, because if that's true, actually, then AI would take over, because in chess, we know already Deep Blue, IBM, it beat the world's best chess player. And so chess is there's a best math decision you can make it every time. In life, There's probabilities. There's a good decision, but there's still probabilities. So you can make a good decision and it leads to a bad outcome. So yeah, when I happened to be in high school and college, it was during the heydays. If you follow poker at all, in 2003, we televised the World Series of Poker on ESPN, and this no-name accountant from Tennessee, aptly named Chris Moneymaker,
that's awesome.
Wins the World Series of Poker. He qualifies through a $10 satellite tournament on Poker Stars, and he's this nobody that becomes this overnight multimillionaire. And it took the world by storm. Everybody and anybody was playing poker. And I happened to be fairly young when this happened. It was the end of my middle school into high school, and I was obsessed. It felt like this first time where it was like, there was risk, there was human elements, there was math. It was so much fun. And so for a brief period of time, I happened to be one of the top online poker players in the world, and I happened to have been doing it underage. So I don't think I can get in trouble by saying that out loud, but I've had my fair share of getting kicked off of accounts. But that kind of led me to really appreciating the poker minds. And so one of the reasons I actually ended up investing in said verticalized oatmeal company called Oats Overnight, the CEO is one of the best cash game poker players in the world. And I have this signal in my investing. It sounds kind of silly, but I call it the chapter 2 comedy signal. And what that means is, how ridiculous was chapter 1 to chapter 2 switch? This guy went from being a top 10 cash game poker player in the world to running a vertically integrated oatmeal company. I mean, you couldn't ask for a starker difference of life of career choices. And, somebody that is able to think in that level of game theory and probabilities and decision making, to me, is an aspect of a truly extraordinary operator. So I think poker is a great way to look at kind of how life works. And I have an affinity for operators and founders that are poker players as well.
Well, that's really cool. That's great
And that's great investment advice, Paul. If you think about it, it's luck and skill.
Yeah, I always bring up poker, but then I have to immediately bring the disclaimer in of we don't look at investing like gambling. So, I try to limit it anymore. If you go back and listen to our pods, I'm constantly talking about when odds are in your favor and stepping away and waiting in and all of those things that poker players know to do and analyzing. And I always like to go back to the famous quote, if you've been at the table for 30 minutes and you don't know who the rube is, it means it's you.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I've learned that lesson.
Yeah. Well, I'll say too, just, there's an author of a book, and I'm actually just looking up his name, Jim Collins. He wrote a book called Good to Great, and this really stuck with me. It was the first conference of my first job out of school. I was a sales engineer at Box.com. And he said in his keynote speech that life is about capitalizing on good opportunities, and you can't control necessarily when those good opportunities will show up, but you can control if you act on those opportunities. So rather than saying ROI, he calls it ROL. So instead of return on investment, it's return on luck. And so the best thing you can do as an entrepreneur and, or as a venture investor is to give yourself as many opportunities as you can to get lucky. And if you can improve your, your at-bats and, your swings at those lucky situations, then, you're bound to hit, some home runs along the way. And so I really think about how much can I increase my chances of being lucky. And, I'm happy. It's always, then you always say it's better to be lucky than be good. Well, better to be lucky as much as possible. And so optimizing for that ROL formula.
You literally just gave us a perfect spot to end this podcast because the name is The Fat Pitch. And it came from Williams talking about waiting for the fat pitch. But he was in there in the batter's box looking for it, right? He was creating it. There's a famous story about him on the final day of the season. It was a doubleheader against the then Philadelphia A's, I think. He was already over 400. He could have sat out. He chose to play both games of the doubleheader. And if my memory serves me, hit well over 500 that day. But he divided that strike zone into some unbelievable amount of little quadrants, looking for, at your point, when to swing and to create action. So Clint always asks everybody, I'll steal it for him. How can people find you? Are you on Twitter? You on LinkedIn? Anything like that?
Yeah, sure. Impatient.vc is our website. It's a work in progress, so you won't see much there other than a couple of emojis. But we're on Twitter, Impatient Ventures. I believe it's at Impatient VC. I got it right in front of me. Yeah, at Impatient VC. My email is jack@impatient.vc. So, yeah.
Dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, I get plenty of inbound, and I'm pretty good at looking at them for at least 30 seconds and deleting it.
How about Twitter? Are you a tweet guy?
Yeah, my handle for the fund is at Impatient VC, and then my personal one is just at my last name first, second name, so at Dreifuss Jack. I will occasionally tweet. It almost feels like a teenager's diary. So, he's
probably tweeting about getting beat on a full house by some crazy flop.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes update my bio. And so I get a little cute. There's the most recent thing is I say I'm a comparative mythologist, because if you think about it, what is life other than my mythology against yours? So, I kind of get more cute on Twitter than I do serious, but it's a great, obviously, place for information. But, I'm excited. I couldn't be more opportunistic about the future of both this country and inside this sort of tech and innovation space, and, excited to be a participant in it all. So.
Well, thank you very much. This, for me personally, was incredibly riveting, and it's nice to hear somebody with a positive outlook.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so Jack. Much. Clint, thanks. Thanks, Jack. Everybody, tune in this week, tune in next week. We'll continue to bring you some fantastic guests, and hopefully it's the next fat pitch you're looking for.